I'm your favorite student today.
There we go. The way I titled the class Hamavdil ben Kodesh Leho, Uven Ula Hoshech, Uven Yisrael Ami. Right? We say this in Havdalah. We say this every Saturday night. We say Hamavdil, obviously the word of separation between Kodesh and Hol. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. We're coming after Shabbat. We separate between Kodesh and Hol. That's what we do. Right? Ben Order Lehoshech is a little bit stranger. Between light and darkness, we separate. What's the separation between the light and darkness? Right? We don't need to do anything to separate between light and darkness. Seemingly, it has nothing to do. One has nothing to do with the other, really. Right? Okay, light and darkness. What does that mean? So keep that in mind. And then all of a sudden in the Havdalah, we add the words Uven Yisrael Amin. And we talk about between Am Yisrael and the other nations. So now it's like really odd, how did we get here? We're talking about, but on a Saturday night, we finish Shabbat. Okay, Mavdil ben Kodesh Leho. So we'll first talk about Hamavdil ben or Lehoshech. Where did God separate between light and darkness? This is what Hashem did in the first day of creation. Vayavdel Elohim ben ha'or ben ha'choshech. He separates between light and darkness. And the rabbis are perplexed. What does that even mean? How do you separate between light and darkness? Because either there's light or there's darkness. Darkness is the absence of light. If there's light, you don't need to separate. So they try to give one answer, but then they give this answer that I think is really, gets to the spirit of the holiday of Hanukkah that I think is really very important. The rabbis say as follows. They say God saw the light. He saw that it was good for the tzaddikim, and he took it and he separated it from this world and saved it for Olam Haba. So therefore, only the tzaddikim can use the light. The Rishaim can't use the light. Meaning, what idea is the Midrash playing off of? They're playing off this metaphorical idea of light and darkness representing good, right, good and evil, right? That's what they're playing off, right? So the Sadiq, the righteous person, is compared to a light. The evil person is compared to darkness. And all of a sudden, what really we mean to say the rabbis, when we talk about God separating between light and darkness, we're talking about God separating between good and evil in this world, right? And actually, when Adam eats from the tree, what does he gain? He's going to gain the ability to distinguish between good and bad, right? It's a dot. So there's something godly that God needs to do to separate between the concepts of good and the concepts of evil, not really night and day, right? We seem to be speaking metaphorically. And then it would kind of make sense if we're talking about Kodesh and Hol. So you're talking about light and darkness, you're talking about the same idea. It's a value statement. And then that would mean when we're talking about Yisrael and the Amim, we're also talking about Kodesh and Hol, and we'll get to that as well. So it's interesting that Hazal, when they looked at the Brit Ben Abitarim, when Hashem is speaking to Abraham and all of a sudden darkness descends upon him, they say, and they find the hint to the 4 exiles that Am Yisrael had. Specifically, the darkness, they say, corresponds to the Greeks. Right? So the story of Hanukkah, they associate the idea of Hoshech, of darkness, with the Greeks in the story of Hanukkah. That's what they do. They make this connection. So now, obviously, you probably have ideas automatically flooding at you. Oh, okay, so the menorah light, is that a coincidence? Obviously not, but we'll get to that. We'll get to that as well. But the question really is, what do the Greeks have to do with darkness more than Bavel, more than Rome, the people who destroyed the Beit HaMikdash? Why are we talking about darkness with the Greeks specifically?
Spiritual?
Right, so obviously, right, so we have to say, right, because as opposed to the other exiles, which represented physical exiles, Bavel destroying the Beit HaMikdash, Rome destroying the Beit HaMikdash, and Egypt with slaves. The story of Hanukkah. So yes, we weren't exiled. They did have control over the Beit HaMikdash. They did, but yeah, the Hazal are reading into it that we're not really talking about a physical fight, we're talking about a spiritual fight for the identity of Am Yisrael. Why would they do that from the story? And the answer is it has nothing really to do with the Greeks per se. It has to do with Am Yisrael. What happens? This is the first time Judaism is coming into contact with a advanced culture whose premise is they're not just warriors who are capturing people, but what they're doing, they're bringing their culture to people as well. And they're reshaping the world this way, right? So they come to Egypt and they capture Egypt and they build a city, Alexandria, and they bring in all their Greek philosophies and their Greek culture into it, and it's a beautiful thing. And wherever they go, they do this process, what we know is called the process of Hellenization. It's not just they're going to capture you, they're going to convert you, which is obviously a very effective thing if you want to maintain an empire, to tell everybody, okay, you're part of the same empire, right? Bringing about freedoms to everybody, and you're part of the program, and here's our culture, and it's for you to enjoy, and then you become Greek, and then you don't even realize the distinction between you and the people who captured you, because you're essentially one of them. So what happens? The Greeks come in, they come into the land of Israel, and they're doing the same thing that they always do, and this is how they maintain the empire. And obviously, whatever, the Greek empire splits a little bit, so fine, it's not just one Greek empire, it's 3 different Greek empires, but this is the program that they have. Okay, we have a very nice program, we're going to give you these things, we're going to make you Greek. And the problem is that it's very attractive. People say, "Oh, okay, yeah, this makes sense. I wanna be like this. I wanna join the program." And you have a lot of Jews who are becoming completely secular Jews, to the point where the Mishnah talks about people who are moshech their orlah, which means, right, Jews who had a brit milah, they look different than the Greeks who don't have a brit milah. So they try to unnaturally stretch their foreskin to make it look like and undo the Brit Milah that they once had. This is the level that we're talking about. Keep in mind, when the Greeks would do their athletic games and their exercise, they would do it naked. There were no, Nike didn't exist yet, so they would do it naked. So now the guy he looks different than everybody else. I don't want to look different than everybody else. So what does he do? He does this in order to make himself look like everybody else, in order to fit in. So we have a full adaptation of culture. His historians go further. It's not 100% verified, but what seems to be that the only reason why the Greeks actually passed decrees against the Jewish people is at the request of the secular Jews who were trying to hasten the process of secularization. It's not so clear. There's a whole disagreement amongst historians. Is that actually the case or not? But they do point out the reason why they're getting there is because traditionally it's not something that they did. They didn't really care to pass decrees against your religion, but here they actually do. Why? What was different? And it might be this pointing to this internal strife within the Jewish people and attempting to create a secular culture. But what they did, regardless, what we know they did, they put a statue of Zeus in the Beit HaMikdash. You have the courtyard of the Beit HaMikdash. You have people, Jews, who are now doing athletic games and whatever they're doing right outside the Beit HaMikdash. It's a crazy. But you know what? It's the first time they come into contact with something, and they're getting excited. I mean, this is the age-old story of Jews in the ghetto, and then comes, let's say, Napoleon or whoever comes and gives emancipation and tells the Jews, you could be part of our world. And what happens? Unfortunately, what happens often is that Jews are running. They could finally be part of something they were deprived of, and it's exciting and it's new, and they're discarding the old and looking forward to the new. And therefore, what do the rabbis see this as? They see this as a darkness creeping over the Jewish people, and it's covering the light of the Torah, the right light of the beauty of Jewish internal culture that we have, and it's just being consumed by this darkness that's slowly and slowly increasing and increasing, and the light is flickering and flickering and almost going out. So,
Rabbi, I have a
yeah.
question. But okay, so yes, there are always Jews that are enticed and all that.
No.
But there was no like one person that said, okay, this is not allowed in the Beit HaMikdash.
Oh, of course there was. So that's how we have the story about Matityahu. What happens?
Oh, okay, right.
Right? No. So that's exactly what happens. Matityahu
Okay.
eventually loses his mind. They talk about what specific event caused him to lose his mind. He says, "No more. We refuse to accept this.
Okay.
This is too much." They go hide in caves, and slowly they have a rebellion. And of course, who is part of the rebellion? Normally, just like any other time, who are the more religious people? The people who live in we'll call them the villages as opposed to the cities. The people, right? The people kind of, and some of the same idea you can see, right? The people who come into less contact, they're probably a little bit on general. They have less money, they have less status within society, right? These are the types of people who are holding on to the Jewish culture, who are not impressed by, they do their own thing. And therefore they say, okay, this is too much. And eventually they go into fight. And that's how they eventually knock out the Greeks and maintain their independence. And that's why we talk about they purify the Beit HaMikdash. You have to purify it from all these, get rid of the idol and everything else that was happening in the Beit HaMikdash. So they're fighting over 20 years. Matityahu dies, Yehuda dies. A lot, 4 out of 5 of his sons end up dying. So at different points in time, there are many different wars that are happening. If we, can assume that these historical sources are accurate, it's not a story that's happening in one day. Right?
Never think that.
Yeah, well, right. We often think, it's a story that how they fought. There was one war. No. They fought. They knocked out the garrison. They sent in a new army, and then they're constantly back and forth. And his sons are dying along the way. He's paying the price with everybody else along the way. You have stories of Jewish bravery and sacrifice, and that becomes part of the Hanukkah story, which is another factor which we'll get to. It's an interesting element of the Hanukkah story. So you have this Hoshech, and eventually the Jews manage to fight it back. And they fight it back, and what do we say? Oh, there's a little bit, they come to the Beit HaMikdash, they find the pure oil, lasts 8 days until we get the next production of pure oil. Meaning, what's the idea that the rabbi is trying to say? What's the symbolism of this miracle of the oil? It's not the main part of the story. The main part of the story is the fight for Jewish independence, maintaining our culture, not being fully assimilated. So what's the value of this oil and this miracle? It's the sign from God that symbolically the light of the Torah, the Or, is never going to be fully encompassed by the Hoshech. The Kodesh and the Hol, the Temi'im B'yad Tehurim, this idea, Yisrael versus the Amim, there's always going to be remnant of purity. There's always going to be something that's going to remain. There's always going to be a core of Jewish identity, and it's never going to be fully, dissolve and become fully tameh and losing your identity. It's always going to remain. So that's why we talk about the candles. So the candles have to last for 8 days. The light has to last for 8 days until the new oil comes into play, and specifically the light, because if the Greeks are the darkness, so we need to be able to have the Jewish lights. It's now all of a sudden we're realizing it's not just a nice thing that happened, it's a cute thing that happens. There's a very deep symbolism within this idea, and that's how it answers a lot of the questions that the rabbis always ask. Why do we need to have the candles lasting for 8 days? What's the significance? Everybody's tameh anyway. Why do we care? What about the other functions in the Beit HaMikdash? And now we kind of have our answer of what we're talking about. No, it's the symbolism is more important than anything else about these oils lasting for 8 days. That is proving everything that we fought for, that the Jewish lights will always remain, the Jewish culture will always remain. So that's what we're talking about. Oh, okay, beautiful. That becomes the story of Hanukkah, and that it's a military victory in order to maintain our Jewish independence, to prevent the darkness from encompassing us and losing our own distinct culture. Okay, which is very nice. Except that it's more complicated than we think. So what does this mean? So does this mean that the rabbis had nothing to do with Greek culture, that they weren't involved? The problem is, if you open up Masechet Sukkah, for instance, and they're talking about the square footage or whatever, square amot, in their terms of a circle sukkah, they use the concept that we know as pi to figure out the area of the sukkah, right? 3.14. When they're trying to figure out the angles of a hypotenuse, they know to do Pythagorean theorem: a squared plus b squared equals c squared. So it's clear the rabbis learned from the Greeks. I mean, there's no way we could say otherwise. There's medicinal ideas that they talk about in the Gemara that are clearly Greek ideas. We could find them in the writings of Galen and stuff like that, and we based halachot off of them. So this idea that the Gemara has a baby that's born in 8 months is not going to live. A 7th month baby will live, a 9-month baby will live, an 8th month baby won't live.
Really?
So it's a Greek idea, and they actually say, so the baby's going to stay on Shabbat because it's going to die. Fine, whatever. Obviously, we don't follow that halakha today, but you get the idea that the rabbis, they're not blind to what's happening within the Greek world. We have words that are clearly of Greek nature, right? How do we say a heretic in Judaism? Apikoris. This is not a Hebrew word. It's a Greek word named after a guy called Epicurus, right? I mean, right? When you think about it, you realize the rabbis are not blind to what's happening in the Greek world. So it creates for us a big problem, because we're talking about this idea of protecting Jewish lights, protecting our culture, our identity, and we're going to war because of it. We're not allowing ourselves to become tameh. We're maintaining that purity. God is helping us out. Beautiful.
I don't think it's a problem.
Okay.
It's not a problem.
Okay.
We're supposed to have that.
So it's not a problem. It has to be. We're supposed to have that. So no, but then the question becomes, okay, so what's the darkness and what's not the darkness? Right. All of a sudden, you see how the question now becomes complicated. So there's some things that we say, yeah, I could learn from them, and I can even maybe base halachot based off what I learned from them.
Mhm.
And then there's sometimes we say, no, that you're darkening Judaism.
So I guess if it fits within the realm of halakha, then it's okay.
Right. So So the question, okay, but play out the question. Okay. So
I mean, I don't know about halakha.
Okay. Yeah, no, so okay, so right, so we say that there has to be some level of acceptability, and sometimes it works and it's beautiful and enhances Judaism. It works very well with Judaism. The Jewish astronomical calculations for determining the Jewish calendar go very well with Greek observations of the year and the seasons and how the cycle of the sun around the earth, or whatever, that's what they thought, right? Of the earth around the sun, either way, right? That's what they thought. But meaning this, so clearly they're accepting things, they're using it to enhance Judaism, but at the same time, there are things that are not okay. So what happens? The rabbis, they don't really go into what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. They seem to have kind of just lived it, right? Keep in mind, especially if we're talking about the rabbis of the Gemara, they're not really so concerned from the Greek culture at that point in time. It seems to have been that whatever it was. They have different concerns. They have Christianity is a concern for them at this point in time, which is a group that develops from within Judaism. Keep that in mind. So that's maybe a concern for them. They have persecutions from Rome. They're dealing with different things. They're living already in a different time period. Now it becomes a question that reverberates throughout history now. How do we deal with things that exist within other cultures? What do we do with this? Now, I'll give you an example. What's happening in, let's say, like Germany, like 200-300 years beforehand, during the creation of Reform Jewry. So what happens? So first you have Moses Mendelssohn translating the Chumash into German. It's a beautiful translation. We do this all the time. We have Art Scroll, we have JPS, we have Koran, we have a million different translations. They flipped out on him because what are you doing? You are telling Jews in order to procure Jewish knowledge, you don't need to know the Hebrew language. We're making it acceptable for you to learn Torah in a different language. And you're pointing out, okay, you could read Jewish information in the vernacular. Oh, this is a terrible thing because that means you're saying it's okay to read German. And at the expense of making sure you know Hebrew.
Weren't they reading German anyway? I mean,
Not
go to the store. I mean,
no, they weren't really. Keep in mind, they're in the ghetto, so they're not really, right?
no, yeah.
At that point in time, you're talking about 1800. Yeah, not really. They're not really yet involved. And they're saying, "What are you doing? You're opening up the floodgates to get us involved." And then they start having the rabbi give a speech in the synagogue, and instead of Yiddish, let's say, he's giving a speech in German. What are you doing? Now, so why am I choosing these examples? Because they're easy ones, in the sense of, yeah, okay, obviously we do this. This is what they did, and we do this today within Orthodox Judaism, and these are things that are completely right. No one really challenges these things. Nobody's going to complain about Art Scroll translating, and nobody's going to complain about the rabbi giving a speech. These are basics of Judaism. This is how we function. These are easy things to deal with. They're things that are not complicated. So what was once new and suspicious, taken from other cultures, all of a sudden, over time, we say it might be okay. Even though we'll point out that when Mendelssohn creating his German translation on the Torah does hasten the advent of the reform movement within Judaism, right? Which is obviously,
That wasn't his intention.
yeah, but I mean, that's a more complicated question.
Is it?
Was probably not his intention, but more complicated, right? That's a whole story for another day. But meaning the point I'm trying to show is that, yeah, as things become okay, they might have not been okay at the time. Question is, how are we interacting with these cultures? What is okay? What is not okay? There were situations where, okay, in the church, they had organ music. So in the synagogue, can I hire non-Jews to play Kabbalat Shabbat music in the synagogue? And in Italy, they did that, and they actually composed music for the non-Jewish musicians to play on Shabbat, because music being played by a non-Jew on Shabbat, like Sorech Mitzvah, is mutar, right? So now, obviously, a lot of other things. What are you doing? What you're copying what the non-Jews are doing? That's a terrible thing.
Actually, though, I mean, we had music in the Beth and the Bash. So really,
Of course we did.
Trust.
Of course we did. No, obviously, meaning the point, I guess, it's clear, right? Music and religion go together. But we don't do that today. Why not? No, that's a non-Jewish thing, not a Jewish thing, right? That's kind of what became the thing. But in 2020, today, we don't do that. We stay away from these things. So
it could have become one of
it could have, it would have, maybe, but it depends. Right? This is the challenge that Judaism has. It's not about the intrinsic value of something, which, as you're pointing out, is clearly Jewish from the Beit HaMikdash, but it's now a question of, what are we doing? Are we opening ourselves up? Are we making ourselves too susceptible to following the cultures outside of us? They had the same debate when we talk about flowers in the synagogue, because then they put flowers in the church. Is that something we could do? We cannot do, right? And again, this is something obviously standard that we do today, but you can see how difficult it is. And there's all various halachic teshuvot about it, about how difficult it is, what is becoming too modern or not. Or if you want me to give more modern day examples. In what sense? Excellent.
Could we put like beautiful artwork in
the synagogue? So this is
related, or is that
so this is this is a good question. So traditionally, they've always had artwork within the synagogue. If when they uncover these old synagogues, they find mosaics in the tiles and stuff like that. So traditionally, artwork always existed in the synagogue. Today, we kind of limit it to like windows. Right. Oftentimes, but if you go to Avenue P and Ocean Parkway to Beit Yosef, they have in their shul upstairs, they have artwork around the walls. We don't love it because we want people to actually pray and not be distracted. So that's a separate issue. Where should you put it, on what walls, how to not create a distraction? But it's something, definitely a time-honored tradition of part of beautifying the synagogue, right? So that's what I'm saying. It seems to be almost random. What's okay, what's not okay. But let me fast forward in history. We start to all of a sudden we get to the 1950s, the 1960s, and all of a sudden you have something that doesn't exist before. You have an intermingling of the genders in society that didn't really exist before. So now all of a sudden we start finding interesting halachic questions. All the rabbis talk about mixed dancing. They all talk about mixed dancing. I mean, they're all saying how terrible it is and what a problem it is. But they're all of a sudden around this time, every rabbi has a, I don't know if it's really a teshuvah because there's not much that we're really discussing. They're just yelling about it and they're talking about it.
Because why? Because in America, because of the whole
Right.
1960s movement.
Yeah, but it's
and that.
even a little bit before. Yeah, once the gender started intermingling in secular society in a way that was a common, right? It used to be they would go to the beach in,
Yeah.
very fancy clothing, and then all of a sudden they didn't, and then all of a sudden what's happening, right? So these are all relatively new things. They talk about youth movements of boys and girls. Can they sing together, Pismunim on Shabbat? Because now, is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing? And obviously, you could tell different segments of Jewish Orthodox Judaism took very different approaches about these things. That obviously goes without saying, mixed schooling. Can you have mixed schools? And obviously, again, these were things that.
The whole girls' school movement, that alone.
Well, the girls' school movement alone, correct, right, definitely. And then it became, what about co-ed education, right, very shortly thereafter. And so you have all these issues that even within Judaism today kind of still play out. If you look in the Yerushalayim in the 1940s, 1950s, all the rabbis are screaming about that they opened the movie theater in Yerushalayim.
Mm.
Right, think about this. All of a sudden, now you're bringing in foreign culture. What are you doing? And they're screaming about it like this is the worst thing in the world. Fast forward to 2020, nearly the segments of Jewish society, nearly every segment of Jewish society has internet access. It's producing material on YouTube and stuff like that. Okay, and what do we do? So we have Jewish materials being produced, and obviously when it comes to music as well, so we have Jewish music being produced. But the question is, okay, what about listening to non-Jewish music? And all these things you have in the internet, is it filtered or not? Are you pursuing secular education? Do you go to college? Do you not go to college? Do you do them in college? Do you not do them in college? Right? All these questions that we all kind of always have, questioning our Jewish identity. What do we do? And all of a sudden, right, it's the same idea. It's the question, but it's a little bit different. Same idea. What's the difference? As opposed to Antiochus coming and making a decree and enabling the Jewish community to realize, wait a minute, what's at stake here? He's boxing us into a corner. We want to fight for the lights of Judaism. Instead, what we have now is something very different. We have a concept of they're allowing us to enter our society. How do we take advantage of the positives of what the society has to offer, while at the same time strengthening our Jewish identity? And there you have a lot of different approaches of what Jewish people do, and you have different communities do very different things. Literally, you have Hasidic communities that they go into random places specifically to avoid these issues. So they say, I don't want anything to do with secular society. And, that's the most extreme. And then you have all the way along the line. But at the same time, you have what Rabbi Sachs will call the Silent Holocaust, that the amount of Jews we're losing to secular society in the United States of America. He calls it the Silent Holocaust, and he brings the statistics, the very powerful.
When you bring that up, why didn't rabbis and other communities adapt what Rabbi Kassan and Alav Shalom started without him? Why did you do that? It worked so well.
So you have to realize what happens. Most of the Jewish communities at the time, what happened was the rabbis and the congregation, like in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, they start off as Orthodox. and they switched to becoming Reform congregations because of these issues. How are we going to maintain community? We need to drive to the synagogue. A lot of various different issues that existed in America. There wasn't enough of a strong basis. It was just easy to leave Orthodox Judaism. It wasn't enough of a thing. Our community is probably a little bit luckier. We came later on. We were more immigrant and a little bit more different, and we came from a Eastern society mindset as opposed to a Western society mindset. So we didn't naturally fit into the mindset of the United States of America. Probably, different factors that enabled us to maintain our own independent communities a little bit better, but not because of, I don't know, it could have very easily went in a different way, depending upon the rabbinic leadership, depending upon the strength of people. And all of a sudden, you just get accustomed to different norms, right? You're in America and you make concessions based on the needs of your community. And all of a sudden, before you know it, you're in a completely different place.
But I'm saying, so Rabbi said, I mean, why couldn't, even now, why can't newly Orthodox synagogues or communities take on what we did?
No, so listen. Orthodoxy but Orthodoxy in America, in that sense, it's pretty strong, even amongst the Ashkenaz communities. That with the creation of the Jewish day schools, it saved Orthodoxy, enabled it to grow to the heights that it never really reached before in the United States of America. So we're pretty much right. Right now, we don't talk about, when we talk about assimilation within even the modern Orthodox Jewish community, you're not talking about a large segment of the population, thankfully. You're talking about a much smaller percentage. Okay, we're losing people, but what's the percentage? There's going to be a natural sense of attrition anyway. How much more can we save? We're working on the margins already. But the majority, we do, right? The average person graduating a yeshiva day school in America, even the modern Orthodox yeshiva day school, is going to send their children, marry Jewish, and send their children to a yeshiva day school. I mean, it's pretty successful in helping maintain the Jewish identity. In the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, none of that existed, and that's probably why we lost so many people. But this idea of how to balance what we'll call the order and the choshech, right? What's the basis? Where do we need to start from? The idea that Judaism has order, right? When we talk about Yisrael, I mean, identify first, know yourself, know Yisrael, know you have a light unto yourself, know what you stand for, know that you have a concept called Kedusha, and then you have to distinguish. Okay, so what's not Kadosh? What's whole? What's acceptable whole? What's whole that's going to be bad? What's choshech? What's going to lose my identity? Is this thing easy? No. And that's why we do something fascinating. Where do we put the beracha of Havdalah in on Saturday night? And the beracha of Honin Hadat. And the beracha in which we're asking for wisdom. Meaning, right, in the Amidah, on Arbit on Saturday night, right, we add in the paragraph of Havdalah in that beracha. Yeah, right. So why? And says the Gemara, because to be Mavdil requires a lot of wisdom. To be able to distinguish requires a lot of wisdom. But what you first have to do before you distinguish anything is first understand who you are, what your identity is. And that's why Jewish day school is so important. What is your Jewish identity? Okay. Then you go out there, you see the other ideals. Okay, so what's acceptable to be included within Judaism, what's not? I mean, they talk about so many funny things. They talk about hunting. Is hunting a Jewish activity that's allowed? Boxing. Can you have a concept of a Jewish boxer? Can Jews be spectating? Should Jews be watching football? Are these in line with Jewish ideals? No, so you're laughing, but when you think about it, and we know.
I tell my kids, football is such a boy sport.
Oh, okay. But so, I mean, it's barbaric. You have people, if you know what's happening, you know how to, you know what they're doing to their brains, and then you sit there as a Jew. How could you be involved in these activities in any which way, especially spending money, going to games? What are you doing? Right? I mean, what does it mean to be a Jew, to have a sense of Jewish identity? And you can see how very quickly it gets kind of like, in the more yeshivish world, what's the one sport they like? baseball,
Oh,
right? Baseball is like, gentleman's sport, right? There's no physical contact. Okay, fine, whatever, right? But again, it's this idea of, if you go to Holland Wyatt Yankee Stadium, half the place is like
Yeah.
Jewish. It's very strange. But so what's acceptable? What's not acceptable? How do you manage? How do you manage these things? Everybody obviously is going to reach their own conclusions, but it all starts with the concept, the holiday of Hanukkah, reminding us, okay, we have lights too. And by the way, is it any coincidence that Hanukkah happens in the darkest time of the year, when the daytime is the shortest and the nights are the longest, and all of a sudden we're reminding ourselves amidst the darkness that we're lighting these candles of Judaism that we call the pure oil? There's clearly something to it in which we're trying to remind ourselves, identify who you are, find the light within you, and then you'll see where you want to take it and exactly what you want to do. Okay, there's a lot of options within Judaism. Ironically enough, Orthodox Judaism is the most diverse segment of Judaism, and the approaches to how to deal with to how to merge the Kodesh and the whole and how to deal with it. You have the most wide-ranging within Orthodox Judaism, which I always find fascinating. I think that's right. Judaism has a wide range of ideas. How you want to merge it, that's up to you. But you have to realize that first, you're Jewish. That's what I think comes first. That's what the holiday of Hanukkah comes to remind us. And then once you realize, well, okay, now you have to be Mavdil. Now you have to separate. So hopefully we take that message to our, families and on this holiday of Hanukkah. And we'll pause here.